Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 52, The Teacher, the Student, and the Seeker, with our guest, Schmian Evans. Hey Schmian, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hey Gina, thanks for having me.
So for the benefit of my audience, can you introduce yourself and tell people who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am Schmian Evans, currently a third-year Master of Divinity student at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. I do a variety of things there, but a lot of the work that I do is in the realm of ministry here at City of Refuge in Oakland, California. Really focus on work with marginalized folks. So I've worked a lot with youth and adults with developmental disabilities, children on the autism spectrum, considered at risk, disadvantaged. I also do quite a bit of work on campus at Pacific School of Religion as well.
Excellent. So, I know I've spoken a bit about it here, and I think maybe now's a good time as any to actually define what marginalized means, because I think it means different things to different people, and I would be curious as to what you mean by that.
The first thing that comes to my mind, or the first word, is a population that's underrepresented, that may not have as much access as people that may be closer to center, and so that are in some ways disadvantaged.
So in your work, how do you help people who fall into that category, and, how do you work within the systems that keep people marginalized?
Yeah, it's challenging, but I think for me, it's about empowerment. So I've seen myself for several years as a bridge builder, and so my service doesn't focus on doing for, but doing with, right? And giving people the tools that they need to be able to work within the system to a certain degree. Some people aren't able to do that, especially some of the individuals I've worked with that are developmentally disabled.
Right.
They're at they're at a stronger disadvantage than maybe some of the other people that I've worked with, but maybe empowering their support systems. And so it's all about empowering people and giving people the tools that they need to maybe access the system or institutions that they work within.
Right. And, I mean, I've seen other people I know that have a real hard time working with the systems. Even my mom had a hard time when she was in high school because of her developmental disability. She's dyslexic and was severely so with the stuttering and all of that stuff. And, it just seems like people just want to forget people.
Oh, definitely.
Who have those kind of disabilities. And, especially in school, it's just like they get, at least in my experience, they got shuffled off to another room and nobody else, they're just kind of there, and you never knew who they were. Yep,
absolutely. I've actually, some of the youth that I've worked with have asked me outright, why am I stupid, or why was I placed in this class? And I think sometimes what happens is that there's sort of like this normative range where people are considered developmental disability, have a developmental disability, or are, cognitively aware, that's just so generalized that people sort of get swept up. And it really can be damaging for people when they sort of figure out that they've been othered. And so it's been really interesting to talk with some of the youth, especially about how that's affected them.
And it's not just damaging in their peer group. It's, it's the system itself.
Oh, definitely.
Because schools are, it's so colonial, right? It's like there's one way to learn and that's it. And like, even for myself, like I can't memorize worth crap, and that's all school is. It's like, if you can memorize, if you can just spit out information,
right.
You'll be in the, advanced classes and stuff.
Oh, definitely.
And it's just like, really, it's kind of time for that to change, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think I'm reminded of something Dr. Renita Weems said when she was here at City of Refuge yesterday. She said that it's important for us to, she referenced a scene in Wizard of Oz where Toto jumped out of Dorothy's arms and pulled back the curtain to see who was actually behind it. I think that is pertinent when we think about our educational system in general and how it's set up, who it's set up for, and how sometimes it is just so rigid, right, that it doesn't really encompass the really wide variety of ways that people engage with materials. And so I think that it's really critical. I know that some of the work that I've done, I've had to change and adjust to students. And it's not that there wasn't a one-size-fits-all model. It's that I just kept trying things from different angles. And more often than not, I was able to find some sort of entry point so that they could access. So I definitely think it's time for some change. And it's been time for a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, even this morning, I was listening to NPR on the way in, and there was a lot of talk about Common Core, and and how I guess they're going to change the algebra program into the high school and elongate the program and make it 2 years instead of 1 year. And there's all about well, what about the super smart kids, and what about this? And it's because there's oh my God, they're all going to be mixed together now. And I'm sitting there thinking, no, that's the best thing, I think, is for different kids of different abilities, and then having the expectations that everybody's going to be able to learn.
Yeah.
This, I guess I have to own up to the fact that, I've been really on that wavelength about the school system needs to change since I was little, because, I don't like standardized testing. I don't like all of that stuff, because it really keeps people from being able to enjoy learning and to get the education that they need.
Yes. Yeah, they're so busy trying to make sure that they measure up, that it becomes much more about that than what actually they're supposed to be taking in and practicing. I think also the emphasis on application is really important, that I think gets lost, because there's it's heavily weighted on competition and the actual grade that you're getting, that the application piece of it sort of gets kind of put on the back burner.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, and I think having ministry as well as working with these students, just in a general level, but having ministry in it, I think that's important, because, being told you're stupid or being assumed you're stupid based on a test or, a disability or whatever is really soul crushing. Oh,
definitely. Definitely. And I think for me, when I think about the many, many years that I've been tutoring and working within the system of education, for me, that is probably the biggest thing that I think I bring to the table. I always talk about the quote unquote tutoring table, right? And so obviously the skills and the information that I have is important, but creating a safe space, building up esteem, meeting students where they're at, affirming them wherever they're at is the biggest gift that I bring to them, because I believe that if a student believes that they can, then I've done the job, right? Because then they'll keep asking the questions and they'll keep seeking out the resources, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what you're saying about things being soul crushing is so, it's just, that gets to the heart of it, right? Yeah.
Well, it's because, it's from when you're really tiny.
Yeah.
You're 3 or 4 and somebody's telling you you're stupid because, you don't see the letters the same way. That's horrible.
Yep. And one of the students that asked me that question was 9 years old. We were tutoring. We were in a tutoring session, and we were going through something or other. I think he was working on his reading skills, and he just stopped and said, what I said earlier. He said, "Schmian, why am I stupid?" And it really took me off guard. Of course, I said some things to him, but it took me a minute because I knew it was a critical moment. This is what it's about, right? And so, at least I hope what I told him was empowering for him. But that is something that's really difficult to unlearn when you're so young. You're taking in information, you're soaking up information, it should be of concern to people, the way that we treat our young ones and adults that are differently abled, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's heartbreaking to hear, right?
Definitely.
I mean, just imagining that coming out from the lips of a 9-year-old, it's like, oh my God, no, I want to hug you.
Yeah, like, no, right, exactly. You're not stupid,
No, you just learn different. But I think that comes into radical inclusion too.
Yes.
It's being accepting of the differences. And I've talked a lot on this podcast about radical inclusion and the acceptance of difference and, acknowledging it and then letting people flourish in their difference. And I think that, it sounds like something that would come into play as well. Yeah.
I think difference is a gift. I've come to see it as that, especially as someone who, I've come to believe that part of my gift is disruption and that's, in the difference, right? Quote unquote difference. And I find that in a lot of ways with my, identify as genderqueer, which for me means that I embrace both my masculinity and femininity, and I blur gender binary constructs. I also am spiritual but not religious, but I serve in a predominantly Christian church. And so I find that's part of the gift that I bring is difference. And I think that there's so much to learn. There is so much to learn about difference, especially when we think about the divine or source or whatever spiritual entity that you may or may not believe in. I think when we think about how we've been created so different, each of us different DNAs, and there's billions of people on this earth, it would make sense, right, that we'd be continually learning from difference, and resist these constructs that we've created, these boxes. So,
why do you think people persist on the boxes, though? Why do you think people persist in saying that this is the only way and the right way, but something different? Oh my God.
I don't know. I don't know that I have an anecdotal response for that. I've often wondered about that myself. I think it has a lot to do with a variety of things. When I think one of the ways that I can describe it best is with an example of my work with an organization and their literacy program for kindergartners. I was there to introduce literature that was a little bit more inclusive. So The Princess Was Saving the Prince, or there was a story where a boy wanted a doll, for Christmas and things like that. And at that young age, they were policing me. I think that, so the point I'm making there is that there are some things that we learn about what is, what isn't, what should be, what shouldn't be, very, very, very young. Even when it comes to, because I have my undergrad is in gender studies and I do a lot around gender, sex, and sexuality and spirituality. A lot of the examples that I talk about have to do with that. But I think about newborns that are brought into this world, or even actually, let me go back. Yeah, actually newborns that are born intersexed, right? That somehow a decision needs to be made about, which gender they're going to be. And so we need to do some snipping or something like that. There seems to be a need, I don't know where it comes from, to define what is and what isn't. That I think there's something scary for people about the gray area. And I'm not sure why that is. Well, so I've said two different things there, but yeah.
Well, I mean, my thoughts on that, it's like, it makes people think, and it's not black and white. It's not like this is the answer and you're done. And, there's a lot, especially in U.S. culture, there's a lot of, there has to be a right answer, and it has to be an exact answer, and it has to, be the end all and be all.
Right.
It's like, it has to be that.
Right. Because a lot of people know who they are by what they aren't. And so they need to have a definition about what is and what isn't in order to define themselves, I think. And I'm always growing, too. I'm challenged in a variety of ways. And it's hard sometimes because some things are ingrained. It's hard to unlearn and to live in the gray area, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even, I see that a lot with my Wiccan Christianness, right? Living in between those two worlds, it's like, it's really hard for some people to wrap their brains around, hey, how can you be of two traditions, and being in that gray area, because they learn very young that the world is a certain way. And I know for myself, it's like, I have to accept that that's how people are, and then work with that until I could, and it's neat because sometimes you can see the brain going click, click, click. Oh,
right. Yeah.
And I think that's true in a lot of situations. And I think even with education, it's like, people don't really understand the need for a gray area or for different models until it's like, oh, right.
Yeah. Yep. One thing that you said reminded me of when you said that you meet people where they are and then you sort of see things turning. One of the ways that I use my work in gender studies with spirituality is that I often use examples that I know from my work in gender studies to highlight the fact that we don't really know what we think we know, that there's, there's difference and there's different ways of seeing things and there are quote unquote gray areas and spectrums. And I was speaking at the Gender Spectrum Conference at St. Mary's College a few days ago. And and it was about working with parents or caregivers with genderqueer, gender questioning, or somewhere in the realm of LGBTQI, two-sexed, and helping them reconcile that with their religion or their beliefs. And one of the examples that I bring up sometimes is the fact that, the term vagina wasn't coined like from the beginning of time, that it was like, I think around the 15th or 14th century. And before that, it was absolutely thought that everything was based on a one-sexed model, that everyone was male, and that that women just had inverted penises, to the point at which in scientific journals there would be outlines for caregivers to keep their young girls really cool. Otherwise, if they heated up too much, their penis would fall out and they'd become boys. And so one thing that I say after I say that is that if we lived during that time, I wouldn't be able to convince anybody that wasn't true, because they'd say, well, it's written here in this journal. Right. So I know it's true. This scientist said this, and this so-and-so said this. And I think just saying that alone gets at what you were just saying about meeting people where they're at. And then you see something starting to shift, like, wow, there's something about that. Right. And so anyway, you just brought that back to my mind. Yeah.
Well, it makes me think we're evolving as a society. And I think, I've described this several times before, so it's probably, to some of my listeners, I sound like a broken record on this, but, I kind of describe the place where our society is at now as its bratty teenager years, because we're shifting from an old society that's very patriarchal, that is oppressive and colonial. And we're moving into this new thing that nobody knows quite exactly what's going to happen, but the power structures are changing. And so you see, especially with some groups of white men, there's like, oh, whaley flaily, like, oh my God.
Right.
And then you're seeing other people being risen up.
Yeah.
And, and nobody really having a consensus on exactly how that's supposed to happen. So, it's a really interesting time.
Yes, it is.
And a lot of stuff changing at once. So, I can see why people would try to really cling on to the traditions, because everything is crazy.
Yeah.
Everything's really changing.
Yeah, I definitely understand the reliance on tradition and the beautiful ways in which traditions bring comfort. And I mean, there's a lot of life-giving traits in tradition. And I agree with you that especially in these times when things are so something, I can't even think of the word, but it's something is happening significantly. And you see it in people just clinging on to what they know that gives these things meaning, right? And so there's something about honoring that and still trying to sort of say that there's room for more, so not diminishing. Right. But how can we widen that perspective so that the traditions are honored, but that not at the exclusion of other people, right?
Well, what I've seen, granted, I don't work with young people all the time, But what I see with a lot of the younger people that I've come across in, just through ministry and through just day-to-day life is that there's a much broader acceptance of people and who they are. And, because, when I did a lot of gender work in the pagan community.
Yeah.
And, when we were doing that, you had your old, trans exclusionary radical feminists are like, oh, trans people are still men, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Trans women are still men.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And, the younger generation are like, dude, really?
Who cares?
What's your deal? I mean, why is this an issue to you? They're women.
Yeah.
Get over it. So it's just kind of like that, their idea of what's right and wrong is very different.
Very different. Yes. Thank God.
Right.
For that. Yes.
I'm hopeful for our future.
Yeah. So am I. Mm-hmm. So am I.
I mean, do you see that in a lot of the work that you do too? Like, do you see students being a little more open and accepting of others to some degree? Different degrees?
I think I see it more implicitly because the work that I do with young folks is usually one-on-one. So I'm not seeing them really out with their friends, right. and I'm not a part of conversations that they're having. And even when I ran after school programs, the dialogue would happen outside of the classroom. And I was working with young kids, so it was very focused. We weren't having a lot of conversation that would bring that up.
Right.
But the reason why I say that implicitly I'm able to pick up on it is how they receive me. Because I find that some adults, find my presentation disruptive. And you can see that on people's faces when I walk into a room. But with a lot of the young people that I've worked with, that's completely absent. And I think that's telling. Right, that I see it more with adults and not so much with kids. I think that's one of the ways I can say that I've been able to see that in my work. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I've seen that in a lot of articles too. Like, I'm a social media junkie, so
Yeah.
But there's a lot of articles that come up these days where it's like, people explaining to kids about what non-conforming gender is and what transgender is and what intersex is, and they're like, yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. All right.
Doesn't seem to be as much concern about labels and, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know you're also a spoken word poet. I'm kind of going tangential, but I'm sure it'll all come back around in the end because that's how spirit works. I know you're a spoken word performer and poet, and you've done some amazing stuff, and I worked with you on some stuff too.
Yeah, thanks
and,
for that.
I'm kind of curious to get into a little bit about how you got into that and how that feeds into your ministry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually started off writing just for myself as a release. I still journal occasionally, just generally, but I used to write poetry to sort of reconcile the things that I was feeling and seeing and et cetera, et cetera. And then one time, I think it was actually at City of Refuge, where I was asked to actually share, which was such an experience for me because I felt so incredibly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then from there, slowly, I've been asked to share more and more and more. And now I'm sharing regularly. How that intersects with my ministry is really, really huge. It is a way for me, because I've never considered myself a preacher per se, but it's a way for me to still bring a word I've found to people. And it always comes from something that I'm struggling with, that I sit with for a while, that somehow there's that transparency and that vulnerability that people resonate with. And so that also, not only do the words affect people in a spiritual way, in some cases, but then even after the word is shared, right, that one-on-one interaction afterwards, where we're able to connect and then network and that kind of thing. I've also recently started spoken word Sundays at City of Refuge. Not just, but I think a couple of months ago, put on my second one. Awesome. And so it's a broadening of that spoken word ministry, because now I'm able to bring in other people, which I love, because there's a mentoring that goes along with that. Mm-hmm. Not always, but the calling people and asking them if they could present, and then hearing them say, I'm nervous, and me saying I was there, and then seeing how it's really helped people. I've seen people cry when they've done their spoken word. I've seen parents come up and say, thank you so much, because this is the way he or she shares, and to know that there's a platform now, right? And I think that there's a lot of ways in which spoken word helps people, and the spoken word that I offer, and the spoken word Sundays. And so I think that's really impactful in terms of ministry and spiritually, helping folks. So,
well, I know when, and I'm probably going to make you blush or whatever now, but I remember, when you did the spoken word piece for my interfaith service, and it was the last piece, and it brought the house down. It was awesome. But, you really summed up that gray area amazingly well.
Thank you.
And also asking the question and making people think about it, is there room for the seeker? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was just an amazing statement because, in a lot of traditions and like in paganism specifically, I should say, there's people that'll be calling the New Agers fluffy bunnies and it's just kind of like this derision of people who are seeking and trying out different traditions and everything. And, I've always tried to tell people, I'm like, listen, at least they're looking, they're finding, they're figuring out what God means to them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, and I think you doing that piece was so important because it gave respect to the seeker.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I really enjoyed that particular piece. And I still remember the posters and the chairs and
Yeah. Oh, it was amazing. I mean, I don't remember a whole lot because there was a lot of spirit flowing around with me that day. But
and it's been a while. It's been some years now. Yeah.
Crazy, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do really it's very crystal. A lot of, especially that question, is there room for me? Mm-hmm. And, that sums up a lot of the ministry when people like you and me are working in radically inclusive ministry.
Yep.
We try to make that room and try to make sure. And I think maybe, okay, so I'm kind of like thinking out loud a little bit here is that, part of that question is vital. Is there room for me? Mm-hmm. And I think that pervades anybody who's doing this kind of radically inclusive ministry like we are.
Yeah.
I think that's like the question.
I think so. And I think that there's so many streams of thought running through my head. I think that it's critical work to ask that question and when we come up against something that may rub us, that we're also standing in that person's shoes. Because I've had experiences where I've had to step back and question, right, am I making room? Because I'm human, right? And so, and all of my humanity, I don't always get it right.
Right.
But I think there's something about keeping that question, even paraphrased or whatever, at the forefront. I think that's critical, especially for ministry, because people are searching for places to be included. People want to belong, and they want to feel accepted as they are. And it can be extreme. It can be so incredibly damaging for people if they're running different places, asking these questions, and the doors keep shutting in their face, right?
Well, it's like with the kids telling them they're stupid from when they're like 2, 3, or 4 or something,
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Yes,
It's
it is.
soul crushing.
It is, yep.
I mean, I've had situations where that has happened, and having that kind of, well, let's put a name to it. Let's say abuse, having that kind of abusive language thrown at you in a spiritual context.
Yep.
Is soul crushing, and it's hard to get over.
It really is.
And then people wonder why people are leaving some religions in droves.
Because people are searching for a community that they can belong to. Yeah.
How do you feel that your spoken word has evolved since you've been doing a lot more of it, and where do you see it going?
Yeah. So I feel excited and nervous. Because I didn't think that it would get to this point. I thought I'd still be writing in my room by candlelight, at 10 o'clock at night or something like that. And I don't know. And I'm learning to sort of live in the questions and I tend to be very methodical and I like to plan things out, but I've learned in ministry especially that ain't happening, basically.
I totally understand.
So I don't know where it's going, but in terms of thinking about things one step at a time, I know that there'll be another one that I'm going to plan another one. As far as where it goes from there, I have a little bit of like spiritual kind of wrestlings, that's going on. I think it might be a part of an ongoing ministry that I do, but I'm not exactly sure. Yeah. And I really want to continue to focus on young adults, because I find that the younger generation has a real connection with spoken word, just word that's a little bit different than the traditional sort of word that's brought. And so I realize that there's a need, and it's something I'm passionate about, so why not keep doing it,
Well, in a lot of ways, they grew up with spoken word as, through hip hop, through, music, through other various things, and watching people on TV. And also, there's a lot of spoken word on things like YouTube and Vimeo and things like that. So it's not,
You're right.
So, the younger generations, they grew up with a lot more spoken word than I think some other people.
Yeah, like me.
Yeah, like me. I totally grokked the whole, sitting in your room writing, at least at first, really bad poetry. Really like.
It was good to me, but.
Angsty poetry. You didn't see the hand going to the forehead there. It was pretty emo. But, I don't write as much poetry now, but I do a lot more memoir-y type writing and journaling and things like that, and I'm, and other kinds of writing. But it's something that really kind of sticks with you, and it's really nice to see poetry and the spoken word and the sharing of it being so universal and so international because of the internet.
Yep, and I'm particularly excited about how some spiritual communities are embracing spoken word specifically, but just generally just something different, that there's room being made for change and,
right.
What's new that's bubbling under the surface. I'm really excited about that because there are a lot of new things that people want to say and share. And sometimes in certain spiritual communities, there's a stagnation because there's a resistance to shift at all. Right. Which can be really damaging, I think. Yeah.
I agree. Well, it's interesting, too, because social justice communities are really picking up on the spoken word, too. Like, I've seen, there's this one, a really amazing one, where it was a black man and a white woman, and the way they rehearsed the spoken word is that they both memorized the whole piece, but the white woman spoke the black man's part, and vice versa. But they were both mouthing the words at the same time. And it was really fascinating to watch because it's like, wow. And what a way to show the systemic problems. Yep. Because they were talking about being a woman and being a black man. And it was just incredible. Yeah. And it just really can really be a powerful way to present those issues.
Absolutely. I think art in general is a powerful way to share these ideas in a way that's very different from getting up to lecture, seeing, a visual media or just hearing something, doing the spoken word, seeing paintings and things like that. There's something about art that I think is just so unique and so powerful and just has a different voice. I mean...
Well, do you think it's just because it works at the heart and spirit level that, sometimes it could work better than just telling somebody, hey, racism, here's the problems,
Well, I think, for me, it's not to say that lectures aren't coming from the heart and spirit, but I think there's just something about art. I don't know if I can put my finger on it. There's just something about the way it works on the senses that I think is just different than just, when I think about seeing a beautiful painting that was rendered from somebody that was living in the civil rights era or something like that, versus hearing a history professor lecture on it. It's not to say that history professor is not coming from the heart, but there's something about the colors and the strokes and where they put this and that and the juxtaposition of different images and things like that I think can touch people in a different way. So I think art is really valuable for that reason, right? Yeah.
It creates a different way of understanding that can punctuate the facts that you know.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, it's so funny. Our society is very strange in regards to art, and I think this kind of wraps up into education too, because in schools, a lot of different school systems, they decide to cut arts first, which is, I think, criminal.
Yeah.
But,
so do I.
But we have this really strange, like in the U.S. specifically, I don't know exactly if in other cultures, although, having my wife from England, I can get a little bit of different perspective from that, because arts is really heavy and a big thing in England. But, there's this idea that, art's not going to get you anywhere. Art's not going to do anything for you. Get a real job, and like I run that in like a lot of crafting circles too. I do hand weaving and hand spinning and things like that. And it's like, oh, that's just a craft. That's not really an art. You know? And you should do art for me for free because it's just art. And so, it just seems...
It's just devalued, yeah.
Yeah,
devalued. It's very
devalued. Yet, you could see art is really important. Like, people are really trying to keep it from going away entirely.
Yeah. I think it's really unfortunate, criminal, like you said, that art is the first to go. And I wonder about that sometimes when I think about how the U.S. ranks in terms of its educational system among other countries.
Right.
And there are a lot of those other systems that actually encourage creativity and art. And I arguably, it's one of the reasons why they are so successful, because it's just a completely different model. When I think about my time at Montessori when I was growing up, it was a lot about creativity.
Right.
And I think there's something that art lifts up, that freedom to be creative allows for creativity. And that, I think, that openness creates that room that we're talking about. We're talking about education and it being sometimes very rigid. There's something about art that breaks that wide open, right?
Right.
And so I think it's really disappointing. We need art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, it's always been scientifically proven, that you hear the commercials all the time. It's like, people who are in art and music, their education, their other academic scores go way higher. They're able to learn better.
Right.
And, and I think it's not just, like with like music specifically, music has a lot of mathematical properties, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think it's just that. I think it's taking care of your spirit.
Yes.
And people tend to forget that when it deals with kids in school and stuff. But, especially in schools with a lot of marginalized people, like, how are you going to take care of your spirit if you don't have a way to express it?
Yep.
And don't learn how to express it and learn how others have expressed it in the past.
I completely agree.
Preaching to the choir here, right?
I'm with you, sister.
Right.
Yes.
Do you tie in your spoken word ministry with some of the work you do with the kids?
Yeah. It depends on what I'm speaking about. I always tie it into some sort of social justice swing, right? But because right now, my tutoring and teaching is shifting, right? So before I entered seminary at Pacific School of Religion, it was mostly working with youth and young adults. And now I'm getting ready to tutor some individuals that are just entering theological seminary, and I'm going to teach a class. And so it's shifting in some ways. But in this shift, I'm doing some other things, and I usually tie in maybe some of the work that I've done, but also some of the work that I do in other areas. It always has some justice bent to it, but it just depends, I think, is probably the short answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do some kids ask you to teach them, like ask you to help them with spoken word stuff or poetry or that kind of writing? No,
because the kids that I've worked with, they don't know that I've done because of the way. So let me give you an example of some of the work that I've done. Like one time I was working in a clinic and I literally just come and I worked with students 1 to 2 hours. So they wouldn't really know me. They wouldn't get to know me like that. Cause right when I sat down, we would start the session, and then they would end and go home. When I ran after school programs, it was the same thing. They came in for that period. So they only know people can't see my hands, but they only know a little tiny bit of my life. So they didn't have an opportunity to get to know me and to know that I've done spoken word and things like that. Not explicitly. So because I do play around, it's not spoken word exactly, but with the art, with the arts when I've been tutoring. So there's, for example, I've put on interviews, and especially for younger kids with autism, especially, I might say something like, welcome to the Jacob Show. Jacob's going to tell us about this wonderful story, that kind of thing. And so that's not necessarily spoken word, but it's certainly art.
Absolutely.
And so no one's ever asked about, how are you doing this? And how do you put these words together and things like that? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting how that, for some reason I'm remembering what my mom did. And you can listen to my I did an interview with my mom a while back, so where she talks about this. But she used to read me all sorts of different things, but she also read me things like Shakespeare because she liked the sound of the words, and the sounds of the words for me were soothing, apparently, because it it helped me go to sleep or whatever when she was reading, because I was a little baby. Yeah. But I think about that, and in the sounds and the way the words flow through poetry and spoken word, and any kind of spoken word like that, and acting and whatever, I guess people don't really always think about the sounds and how the sounds react. Because, people can think about that when they're drumming, because the drumming is pretty visceral. But even our voices, can be in those frequencies that are just like, okay, life is good. That kind of thing. Or rise us up to rage or anger,
Yep, absolutely. I'm thinking about Marvin K. White and his voice. I've told him before that his voice sort of resonates like an African drum. It just is extremely powerful and has a very particular rhythm that is very different than my own. I tend to do my spoken word kind of in the voice that I'm speaking in now, right? Which is different but equally powerful in a completely different way, completely different rhythm, different tone. And so I think, I agree with you that there's something about the delivery to the voice that adds in. It's not just the words, right? It's the entire thing. Yeah.
Right. And and I see that in ritual, because there's a certain particular cadence when I'm doing my own rituals or doing public ritual that I get into, and especially when I'm doing some a meditative trance-like thing. There's a pitch and a cadence that brings people down into that.
Yes.
realm. And it's amazing just how the spirit can work that way, even when you're not really trying to do it.
Right.
So we're just about the end of our time.
Oh, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being on.
Yeah, I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, this has been really awesome. And if people wanted to ask you questions or contact you or, have discuss some of the topics that we've talked to on the show, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, via email would be the best. So Schmian, SCHMIAN @att.net would be the best way.
And we'll put that in the show notes for people.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. This was fun.
I'd like to thank Schmian for taking the time to join with us during the TFAM convocation for this episode. As always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. You can subscribe to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, or follow us on Twitter @TWIH Podcast. And if you can, please support this podcast through PayPal or Patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.